They laughed the loudest the day he started building a house around his own house. The wind carried that laughter across the open fields of Birch Hollow, thin and sharp as the first hint of winter, and Caleb Mercer heard every word without ever turning his head, his hammer rising and falling in steady rhythm, wood meeting wood with a dull, certain thud that seemed to ignore the noise of the world entirely, because some men don't build for approval, they build for what they've already seen coming. At 40, Caleb had the kind of quiet presence that didn't ask to be understood. Tall and broad-shouldered, his flannel jacket faded at the elbows, his jeans worn pale from years of work that no one had watched, his face marked not by age alone but by memory, the kind that settles behind the eyes and never quite leaves, and beside him moved Scout, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a silver-gray coat and amber eyes that missed nothing, not the shifting breeze, not the subtle drop in temperature, not the way the air seemed to tighten as if the land itself were holding its breath. While the neighbors leaned against their fences, shaking their heads and lifting their phones to capture what they called madness, Caleb worked in silence, framing a second structure around his small, weathered house, leaving a narrow gap between the outer walls and the original frame, a design that made no sense to anyone watching, a wooden shell that looked too crude to be useful and too deliberate to be accidental. Man's lost it. Someone muttered, and laughter followed like a ripple through dry grass. But Caleb didn't respond, because he had learned long ago that explanations are wasted on those who haven't felt what you felt, and Scout, instead of resting in the shade like most dogs would, paced the perimeter again and again, nose lifted toward the northern horizon, ears flicking at something distant and unseen, a low sound rumbling in his chest, not quite a growl, but not quite calm either, as if he were listening to a rhythm buried beneath the wind, something too faint for human ears but impossible for him to ignore. The sky above Birch Hollow was still clear that afternoon, pale blue stretching wide over fields that had not yet felt the bite of frost, but the air carried a dryness, a brittle edge that Caleb recognized instantly, the kind that comes before a season turns harder than expected, and as he drove the final nail into place on the outer frame, he paused for just a moment, resting his hand against the rough wood, feeling the faint chill already seeping through it, while Scout stopped pacing and stood still, staring north with an intensity that made the world feel quieter, as if everything else had stepped back to listen, and though no one else noticed it. Though the laughter still lingered in the distance, something had already begun to change, something slow and invisible, moving closer with every passing hour, because sometimes the warning doesn't come as a storm on the horizon. Sometimes it comes as a feeling in the air, a shift only the patient and the watchful ever truly understand. By the next morning, the laughter had not stopped. It had only softened into something quieter, more curious, the kind of curiosity that comes when people do not understand a thing, but cannot look away from it either. And Caleb Mercer was already awake before the sun had fully risen, standing outside with a tape measure in one hand and a small notebook in the other, his breath visible in the cool air as he marked down numbers with slow, deliberate strokes, temperature, wind direction, humidity, each detail written as if it mattered more than the opinions drifting from the road behind him. And Scout stood a few yards away, facing north again, completely still, his ears upright and angled towards something distant, something that had not yet arrived, but was already making itself known in ways only he seemed to recognize. The outer frame had begun to take shape now, wooden beams forming a second skin around the house, leaving a gap of nearly 2 feet between the original walls and the new structure. And inside that narrow space, Caleb stacked split firewood with careful precision, each log placed tightly together but not pressed, leaving just enough room for air to move, because air, when trapped correctly, could become something else entirely, something warmer, something protective, though no one watching from the outside would have guessed that was the intention. Around mid-morning, a pickup truck slowed along the dirt road, tires crunching over gravel as it came to a stop. And out stepped Walter Briggs, a man who had lived in Birch Hollow longer than most could remember, his thick coat zipped high and his hands tucked deep into his pockets as he approached with a skeptical glance. "You planning to live in a box now, Caleb?" he called out, not unkindly but not without amusement either, and Caleb looked up briefly, offering only a small nod before returning to his work. "Just getting ready," he said, his voice calm. steady, leaving the statement open in a way that invited no further questions. Though Walter lingered for a moment longer, watching the dog instead of the man, because there was something about Scout that made even the most practical people pause. The way he did not relax, did not wander, did not lose focus, as if he were guarding against something no one else could see. Later that afternoon, the sky shifted almost imperceptibly, the blue fading into a paler shade, the sunlight thinning as a faint haze settled over the horizon, and the wind, which had been little more than a whisper the day before, began to move with a slightly sharper edge, brushing against the wooden frame and slipping through the gaps with a soft, hollow sound that echoed like a breath passing through a narrow corridor. And Scout reacted immediately, pacing faster now, his nails clicking against the ground as he circled the structure again and again, stopping only to press his nose into the space between the walls, inhaling deeply as if trying to understand what the air itself was becoming. Caleb noticed. Of course he noticed, because he always did, and he closed his notebook slowly, slipping it into his jacket pocket before stepping into the narrow passage between the house and the outer frame, running his hand along the stacked wood, feeling the dryness, the spacing, the quiet stillness held within that confined air, and for a moment, his eyes closed, not in rest but in memory, because there had been a place once, far from Birch Hollow, where the wind had sounded just like this, where the cold had crept in not as a sudden force, but as something patient, something relentless, and he had learned then that survival was not about fighting the elements. It was about understanding them before they arrived. Behind him, Walter cleared his throat softly. "Weather report says it will be a mild winter," he said, almost as reassurance, almost as a way to make sense of what he was seeing, and Caleb opened his eyes again, looking out toward the northern line of trees where the horizon seemed just a little too still, just a little too quiet, and he gave a faint shake of his head, not in disagreement, but in certainty. "Sometimes the weather does not read the reports," he replied, his voice low, almost lost beneath the growing wind. And Scout let out a single, short bark, not loud, not urgent, but deliberate, as if marking a moment that had already begun to shift, even if no one else in Birch Hollow was ready to believe it yet. The following days settled into a rhythm that seemed ordinary on the surface, but carried an undercurrent that only Caleb and Scout appeared to notice, the kind of quiet tension that does not announce itself loudly but lingers in small details. In the way the morning frost began to appear earlier than expected, coating the edges of the grass in a thin, glass-like sheen even before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. In the way the wind no longer drifted but moved with intention, always from the north, always steady, as if it had chosen a direction and refused to let go of it. And Caleb adjusted his work accordingly, reinforcing the outer frame with additional crossbeams, tightening every joint, sealing every gap that did not belong while preserving the narrow channels where air needed to flow, because what he was building was not simply a barrier, it was a system, one that depended on movement as much as stillness. Scout remained restless, more so with each passing day, his behavior shifting from quiet observation to active signaling. He would stop suddenly during his patrols, ears snapping forward, body rigid as if listening to something far beyond the reach of human senses, and then he would release a sequence of 3 short barks, always 3, spaced evenly, not alarm, not fear, but a pattern, a message Caleb had learned to respect without fully understanding, and each time it happened, Caleb would pause, glance toward the same northern horizon, and make another note in his weathered notebook, marking the time, the temperature, the direction of the wind, building a picture that no forecast could provide. The townspeople continued their routines, trucks rolling past, conversations carried over fences, but the tone had begun to shift subtly. The laughter had faded into something quieter, replaced by glances that lingered a little longer than before, because even those who doubted could feel that something in the air was changing, though they could not name it. And one afternoon, as Caleb split another stack of firewood and carried it into the narrow space between the walls, a young boy named Tyler wandered up the dirt path, his boots kicking small stones as he approached, curiosity written plainly across his face. "Mr. Mercer," he called out, hesitant but determined, "why are you putting the wood all around your house instead of inside it?" and Caleb set down the log he was holding, straightening slowly as he looked at the boy, considering the question as if it deserved a real answer, because sometimes it did. Because the outside matters just as much as the inside. He said simply, his voice calm, not dismissive, and Tyler frowned slightly, trying to make sense of it, glancing at Scout, who had now positioned himself between the boy and the open field, not threatening, just present, his gaze fixed once again on the horizon. "My dad says winter will not be bad this year," Tyler added, almost as if testing the idea against what he was seeing, and Caleb's expression softened just a fraction, not with doubt, but with understanding. "I hope he is right," he replied, and for a moment, that seemed to settle it, the boy nodding, before turning back toward the road, though he looked over his shoulder once more at the strange wooden structure before disappearing from view. As evening approached, the temperature dropped faster than it had the day before, the air losing its softness and taking on a sharper edge that carried through the gaps in the outer frame, and Caleb stepped inside that narrow corridor again, feeling the difference. The way the space held the chill but did not let it pass through completely, the wood, acting not as a wall but as a buffer, slowing the movement of cold air, shaping it, and Scout followed closely behind him, pressing his nose to the ground, then lifting it suddenly, releasing another set of 3 deliberate barks that echoed softly within the enclosed space, and Caleb placed his hand against the inner wall of the house, feeling the faint warmth still held there, protected, preserved, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself a quiet breath, not of relief, but of recognition, because the pattern was becoming clearer now, the signals aligning, the air, the wind, the dog, all pointing towards something that had not yet arrived, but was already on its way. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Birch Hollow, the land grew still in a way that felt almost unnatural, as if everything were waiting, not for if, but for when. That night the wind did not howl. It did not crash against the trees or rattle the windows the way storms often announce themselves. Instead it moved low and steady across Birch Hollow, a constant current that seemed to press gently, but persistently against every surface it touched, and Caleb Mercer stood just inside the narrow passage between the 2 walls of his home, listening not with his ears alone, but with something deeper, something learned over years when silence often carried more meaning than noise, his hand resting against the outer wooden frame as he felt the subtle shift in temperature, the way the cold air entered the space but slowed, softened, redirected before it could reach the inner walls, and for the first time since he began building, there was a quiet confirmation in that sensation, not satisfaction, not pride, but a simple acknowledgement that the structure was beginning to do what it was meant to do. Scout did not lie down that night. He did not curl beside the fire or settle into the familiar rhythm of rest. Instead, he remained on alert, moving between the doorway and the outer perimeter, pausing often with his head lifted, nostrils flaring as he tested the air, and every so often he would release those same 3 measured barks, spaced with precision, echoing faintly against the wooden beams, as if marking intervals in something only he could perceive, and Caleb watched him carefully, because the dog had never been wrong, not in the ways that mattered. Sometime past midnight, the temperature dropped sharply, not gradually as it had in the days before, but all at once, as if the air itself had shifted into something heavier, colder, and the faint moisture that had lingered in the ground hardened into frost within minutes, spreading outward in delicate patterns that caught the pale glow of the moon. And the trees at the edge of the field stood completely still, their branches no longer swaying but frozen in place, as though even the wind had chosen to move above them instead of through them. And Caleb stepped outside briefly, his boots pressing into the stiffening earth, his breath forming thick clouds in front of him as he looked toward the northern horizon, where the sky appeared just a shade darker than the rest, not with clouds, but with something denser, something approaching. By early morning, the town began to notice the change, doors opening a little more cautiously, people stepping onto their porches and pausing longer than usual before starting their day, the cold biting sharper than expected, slipping through jackets and gloves with an ease that unsettled even those who trusted the forecasts. And Walter Briggs stood by his truck again, rubbing his hands together as he glanced toward Caleb's place, his expression no longer amused but thoughtful, uncertain, because what had once looked unnecessary now carried a different weight, though he could not yet explain why. Inside the narrow corridor, the firewood remained dry, untouched by frost. The air held between the walls warmer than the open field outside, and Caleb moved through the space with quiet purpose, adjusting a beam here, checking a joint there, reinforcing without overcorrecting. Because the system depended on balance, not force, and Scout followed. Close behind, his movements slower now, but no less focused, as if the urgency had shifted into something steadier, something that understood the moment had not yet fully arrived, but was close enough to feel. As the sun struggled to rise through a sky that seemed less willing to give light than it had the day before, a thin layer of ice formed along the edges of roofs and fences throughout Birch Hollow, subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, but persistent, spreading inch by inch as the hours passed, and Caleb stood once more between the two walls of his home, placing his hand flat against the inner surface, feeling the warmth still there, protected, contained, while beyond that barrier the cold continued to press inward, patient, unrelenting, and for a long moment he said nothing, did nothing, simply standing with Scout at his side, both of them facing north, both of them listening, because sometimes the difference between preparation and survival is not what you build, but when you understand that it is finally time for what you built to be tested. By the second night, the change could no longer be dismissed as an early chill or a passing shift in the weather. It settled into the land with a quiet authority that pressed against every surface, every structure, every breath taken in Birch Hollow, and the temperature fell past what anyone had expected for this time of year, dropping steadily through the 20s and into the teens, then lower still as the hours stretched on. And inside their homes, people began to notice small things first. The way window glass gathered frost along its edges, the way floors felt colder underfoot even with the heat running, the way pipes whispered faint warnings beneath walls not yet fully frozen but close enough to make the air feel uncertain. Caleb Mercer did not rush. He did not react with surprise, because he had already seen the pattern forming days before, and now he moved through his routine with the same steady rhythm, feeding the fire inside the house just enough to maintain warmth without forcing it, allowing the heat to settle into the inner walls while the outer structure absorbed the pressure of the cold. And in the narrow corridor between the two layers, the air behaved differently now, slower, heavier, no longer rushing through but lingering, creating a buffer that softened the bite of the freezing wind before it could reach the living space within. Scout remained alert, though his movements had changed again, no longer pacing in urgency, but walking with purpose, checking each side of the structure, pausing at intervals as if confirming that the system held, his ears still tuned to the north, his body still aligned with something unseen, and every so often he would give a single low bark, not as a warning now, but as acknowledgement, as if something he had been listening for had finally arrived. Across the road, Walter Briggs stood outside his house longer than usual, his shoulders hunched against the cold, watching as a thin layer of ice formed along the edge of his porch steps, something he had not seen this early in the season in all his years there. And when he turned his gaze toward Caleb's place, what he saw unsettled him in a way he could not explain. The outer wooden frame did not rattle, did not creak under the pressure of the wind. It held firm, and the space between it and the house seemed almost still, as if the cold itself had been slowed, contained, reshaped before it could press inward. And for a moment Walter considered walking over, saying something, asking a question he had not thought necessary before, but he remained where he was, uncertain, caught between pride and something that felt uncomfortably close to realization. Inside the corridor, Caleb ran his hand once more along the stacked firewood, dry and untouched by frost, each piece holding its place in a system that relied on patience more than strength. And he remembered another place, another time when structures had failed not because they were weak, but because they had not been designed to understand what they were up against. And here, in the quiet of Birch Hollow, he had chosen differently, building not to resist the cold, but to work with it, to guide it, to slow it down until it lost its edge. As midnight passed, the temperature dipped even further, approaching single digits, and the wind, though not louder, carried a deeper chill that settled into the ground itself, hardening it, sealing it. And across the town heaters began to strain, running longer, working harder, While inside Caleb's home, the warmth remained steady, not overwhelming, not excessive, but consistent, held in place by the careful balance between the two walls. And Scout finally lay down near the doorway, not fully at rest, but calm in a way that suggested the moment of waiting had passed and the moment of endurance had begun. And outside, under a sky that had turned clear and sharp with cold, Birch Hollow stood quietly in the grip of a winter that had arrived earlier, stronger, and far more certain than anyone had been prepared for, except for the man who had built something no one understood, and the dog who had known long before the first frost touched the ground. By the third morning, the cold had settled into Birch Hollow with a quiet permanence that no one could ignore, the kind of cold that does not come in bursts but stays, pressing gently and endlessly until it finds every weakness. And across the town the signs began to show more clearly, frost thickening along window panes into opaque layers that blocked the view of the outside world, door hinges stiffening, car engines turning slower with each attempt to start, and beneath the ground the pipes began to struggle, the water inside them slowing, tightening, on the edge of freezing. And for the first time that season, people stopped trusting what they had expected and started paying attention to what was actually happening. Caleb Mercer moved through his home with the same measured calm, feeding the fire in controlled intervals, never allowing the heat to spike too high, because he understood that sudden warmth could create its own problems when surrounded by such relentless cold. And instead he maintained a steady temperature, letting the warmth soak into the structure itself, into the walls, into the air trapped between the two layers, where it lingered and circulated slowly, creating a quiet barrier that did not fight the cold but refused to let it pass freely. Scout rose early, stepping outside into the narrow corridor, his paws landing softly against the wooden floor as he made his rounds, pausing at each corner, each seam, each place where air moved differently. And his behavior had shifted once again, no longer signaling warning or anticipation, but maintaining vigilance, his ears still angled toward the north, his body relaxed but ready, as if he understood that the danger now was not in what was coming, but in how long it would stay. Across the road, Walter Briggs stood in his kitchen, staring at the faucet as it sputtered unevenly, the water pressure weaker than it had been the night before, and he turned the handle again, waiting, listening, the pipes beneath his floor letting out a faint, strained sound that made him uneasy. And when he looked out the window toward Caleb's house, what he saw no longer looked strange or unnecessary. It looked intentional, purposeful in a way that he had not recognized before, and after a long moment he reached for his coat, pulling it on with a decision that felt heavier than it should have. The walk across the road was short, but the cold made it feel longer, the air biting at his face, the ground firm beneath his boots. And when he reached the edge of Caleb's property, he hesitated briefly, watching as Scout turned his head and fixed his gaze on him, not aggressive, not welcoming, simply aware. And then Caleb stepped out from the narrow passage between the walls, his expression calm as always, as if he had expected this moment. "Morning," Walter said, his voice carrying a different tone now, less certain, more measured, and Caleb nodded once in return. "Cold one," he replied, the words simple but not dismissive, and Walter shifted his weight slightly, glancing at the structure surrounding the house before speaking again. "My pipes are starting to act up," he admitted, the sentence carrying more than just information. It carried the beginning of understanding, and Caleb listened without interruption, his gaze steady, not judging, not surprised, because he had seen this part of the pattern before it unfolded. "It is not just the cold," Caleb said quietly. "It is how long it stays." And Walter let out a slow breath, looking back toward his own house, toward the frost that now clung to every edge of it. And for the first time since this all began, the question he asked was not laced with doubt or humor. "You think it is going to get worse?" And Caleb did not answer right away. He simply looked north, following the same line Scout had been watching for days. The horizon still clear, but carrying a weight that could be felt more than seen. And then he gave a small nod. "It usually does," he said. And in that moment the distance between what had been laughed at and what was now understood began to close. Not all at once, but enough to change the way Walter stood there, enough to make him stay a little longer than he had planned. Because sometimes realization does not come as a sudden truth. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the cold, when there is nothing left to ignore. By the fourth day, the cold no longer felt like a passing condition, but a presence that had settled into Birch Hollow with quiet determination, and the town began to respond in ways that revealed just how unprepared it truly was. Heaters running without pause, drawing more power than the lines could comfortably carry, lights flickering briefly in the early morning hours, pipes in several homes slowing to a thin trickle before stopping altogether, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the sound of running water ever had, and people who had once stepped outside casually now opened their doors with hesitation, as if unsure what the air might take from them this time. Caleb Mercer stood once again within the narrow corridor surrounding his home, his hand resting against the inner wall, feeling the steady warmth that had not faltered despite the falling temperatures outside, and he moved with quiet intention, checking the spacing between the stacked firewood, ensuring that the air channels remained clear, that nothing disrupted the balance he had built into the structure, because he knew that consistency, not force, was what would carry the system through the days ahead. Scout remained close, his movements calm but deliberate, no longer signaling change but maintaining watch, his ears still angled toward the north though the urgency had faded into something steadier, and every so often he would step into the open yard, stand still for a few seconds, then return without a sound, as if confirming that the world beyond the walls had not shifted in any unexpected way. Across the road, Walter Briggs returned to his house with a quieter mind than he had carried the day before, but the situation inside did not improve. The pipes beneath his kitchen sink now completely still, the faucet turning easily but producing nothing, and he stood there for a long moment, hand resting on the counter, listening to the absence of something he had always taken for granted, before pulling on his coat again, this time without hesitation, because understanding had begun to replace pride. When he stepped outside, he noticed that he was not the only one. A few doors down, another neighbor stood on her porch, arms crossed tightly, looking toward the road with the same uncertainty, and though no one said it aloud, the shift in the town was clear. The laughter had disappeared entirely, replaced by quiet glances and unspoken questions. And when Walter crossed the road once more toward Caleb's property, his steps were more direct, his purpose no longer uncertain. Caleb saw him coming and stepped out to meet him, Scout at his side, the dog's gaze moving briefly between the two men before settling again on the open field beyond, and Walter stopped a few feet away, exhaling slowly, the cold air clouding in front of him. "It is worse than I thought," he said plainly, no humor left in his voice, no distance in his tone, and Caleb nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, because he had expected this moment, not as a victory, but as a continuation of what had already begun. "It usually is," he replied, his voice steady, and Walter glanced again at the structure surrounding the house, the outer walls standing firm, the narrow space between them holding a stillness that contrasted sharply with the biting wind beyond. And for a moment he said nothing, simply taking it in, before asking the question that had been building quietly over the past few days. "How does it work?" And Caleb turned slightly, gesturing toward the corridor, not with pride, but with openness. "It slows the cold down," he explained, "gives the air somewhere to go before it reaches the house." And Walter listened carefully, not because he fully understood, but because he finally recognized that there was something to understand. And as the wind moved steadily across the field, carrying with it the weight of a winter that showed no sign of easing, the distance between what had once been dismissed and what was now needed grew smaller with each passing hour, until it became clear that some things are only seen for what they are when the conditions change enough to reveal them. By the fifth day, the cold had moved beyond discomfort and into something that reshaped the rhythm of Birch Hollow entirely, a quiet force that slowed everything it touched, and across the town the signs of strain became impossible to ignore. More homes losing running water, heaters struggling to maintain even a modest warmth, and the air inside those houses growing dry and brittle, carrying with it a stillness that felt heavier with each passing hour. And it was no longer just inconvenience that settled in, but uncertainty, the kind that made people look beyond their own walls for answers they had not considered before. Caleb Mercer stood near the entrance of the narrow corridor surrounding his home, the wooden frame steady against the wind, the space between the walls holding its calm as if it existed apart from the harsh conditions pressing in from the outside, and he watched as Walter Briggs approached once again, this time not alone, but with another neighbor beside him, a woman named Linda Harper, whose breath came out in short, visible bursts as she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, and neither of them spoke at first, both of them taking in the structure that had once been the subject of quiet laughter and was now something else entirely, something that carried the weight of possibility. Scout stepped forward before Caleb did, his movement smooth and controlled, positioning himself at the edge of the property, his gaze moving briefly over the two visitors before returning to the open field, as if acknowledging their presence, but refusing to be distracted from the greater awareness he still held. And Caleb followed a moment later, his expression unchanged, calm and steady as always. "Morning," he said simply, and Walter nodded, though the words seemed insufficient for what he had come to say. "We are having trouble keeping the house warm," Linda added, her voice careful, not asking directly but carrying the question within it. And Caleb listened, not interrupting, not offering immediate solutions, because he understood that this moment was not about instruction. It was about understanding what had been missed. The wind moved through the field with that same low persistence, pressing against the outer frame, slipping into the corridor and slowing, softening, losing its edge before it could reach the inner walls, and Caleb gestured slightly toward the space between the two structures. "It is not just about keeping heat in," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "It is about controlling how the cold moves." And Walter stepped closer, his boots crunching against the hardened ground as he looked into the narrow passage, noticing for the first time how still it felt compared to the air outside, how the temperature within that space did not drop as sharply, how the firewood stacked along the walls remained dry and unchanged despite the conditions surrounding it. Linda followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to understand what she was seeing, and for a moment the three of them stood there in silence, the wind continuing its steady passage, the cold pressing in from all sides. And then Walter spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "We thought you were overdoing it," he admitted, not as an apology, but as a recognition, and Caleb gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acceptance, because he had never built the structure to be understood in advance, only to work when it was needed. Scout let out a single low sound, not a bark this time, but something softer, almost like a breath released, and he stepped back toward the doorway, settling near the entrance as if signaling that the moment of warning had passed and the moment of use had begun. And Caleb looked between the two neighbors, his expression unchanged but his presence steady. "You can use the space," he said simply, not offering more than necessary, not explaining further than he needed to, and the words hung in the cold air for a moment before settling into something real, something that shifted the way Walter and Linda stood there, no longer as observers, no longer as skeptics, but as people beginning to understand that what had once seemed unnecessary might now be exactly what they needed. And as the wind continued its quiet, relentless movement across Birch Hollow, the structure around Caleb's house no longer looked like something strange. It looked like something that had been waiting for this moment all along. By the sixth day, the cold had rewritten the town into something quieter, slower, and far more connected than it had been before, not through comfort, but through necessity. And what had once been separate homes with their own routines and quiet distances between them now began to shift towards something shared, something that moved across property lines and settled in the spaces where people gathered not out of habit, but because they needed to. And the narrow corridor surrounding Caleb Mercer's home became one of those places, not by design in the way others might have imagined, but by the simple fact that it worked. Walter Briggs was the first to step fully into that space, moving carefully between the two walls, his hand brushing lightly against the stacked firewood as if testing whether it was real, whether the stillness he felt there was not just his imagination. And he paused after a few steps, looking back toward the open field where the wind continued its steady movement, then forward again into the corridor where that movement softened, slowed, and finally seemed to rest. And he let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, not because the air was warmer in any dramatic way, but because it was stable, consistent, the kind of air that did not shift unpredictably from one moment to the next. Linda followed soon after, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she stepped inside, her hands no longer gripping her coat as tightly, and she looked at Caleb with a quiet expression that carried more understanding than words could easily hold. While others began to appear throughout the day, not in large numbers at first, but in ones and twos, neighbors who had once watched from a distance now crossing the road with purpose, carrying small bundles of wood, tools, or simply themselves, drawn not by curiosity anymore, but by the recognition that something here made sense in a way their own homes no longer did. Caleb did not organize them, did not instruct them beyond what was necessary. He simply showed them where the air moved and where it held still, how the firewood was stacked to allow space without losing structure, how the corridor functioned not as a barrier, but as a transition between outside and inside. And they learned quickly, not because the system was simple, but because the need to understand it had become immediate. Scout remained near the entrance, his presence steady, his attention still anchored to the horizon, though the urgency had faded into something quieter, something that suggested the storm they had been preparing for had already arrived and settled in. And every so often he would step into the corridor, walk its length, and return, his movements calm, as if confirming that everything held as it should. As the days continued, the temperature remained low, dipping into the single digits at night and struggling to rise much higher during the day, and the strain on the town persisted. But within that strain something else began to form, a shift not in the weather, but in the people themselves, in the way they spoke to one another, in the way they shared space and resources without the hesitation that had once defined their interactions. And the structure around Caleb's house, once seen as unnecessary, became a place where that shift could be felt most clearly, not because it solved everything, but because it provided just enough stability to allow something else to grow. One afternoon, as the pale winter sun hung low over Birch Hollow, Tyler returned, his small figure moving carefully along the path, and he stepped into the corridor with wide eyes, looking around at the people gathered there, at the firewood stacked neatly along the walls, at the way the air felt different without him fully understanding why. And he looked up at Caleb, his voice quiet but certain. "You knew this was going to happen?" And Caleb considered the question for a moment before answering, not with certainty, but with honesty. "I knew something was coming," he said, and Tyler nodded slowly, as if that was enough, because sometimes it is not about knowing everything, but about recognizing enough to prepare. As evening approached and the cold settled once again over the town, the lights inside Caleb's home and the soft glow within the corridor cast a steady warmth into the growing darkness, and people moved in and out of that space with a quiet familiarity that had not existed before, their steps no longer uncertain, their voices no longer distant. And Scout lay near the doorway, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but still aware, as if listening to something far beyond the reach of the wind. And Caleb stood for a moment between the two walls, his hand resting lightly against the wood, feeling the balance he had built holding firm against the pressure of the cold. And he looked out toward the horizon that had first drawn his attention days before, now quiet and still, and there was no sense of victory in his expression, no need to be proven right, only a quiet understanding that some things are not meant to be explained before they are needed, only built, patiently, carefully, until the moment comes when they speak for themselves. And in that moment, without words, they remind everyone that preparation is not about fear, but about care, not about being right, but about being ready when it matters most.